Happy Saturday, everybody. We are coming up on an anniversary for the U.S. Camel Corps. On March 3rd, 1855, Congress approved the appropriation bill that set aside money for the purchase of those camels. So this seemed like a good time to re-release our 2014 episode on the Camel Corps.
Also, this is a story about working animals in the 1850s, so the animal cruelty standards definitely do not match up to what you might expect today. So just know that going in.
Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class from HowStuffWorks.com.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And today's topic is one we've actually been asked about a couple times. It's another one that's also been on my list for a long time. I'm kind of trying to go back to the ones that I wrote down when we first moved on to the podcast as hosts that I was really excited about, and then they get lost in the shuffle.
Oh, you know what happened to mine?
What?
We moved offices and my
and
whiteboard.
The whiteboard got erased.
The whiteboard with my stuff on it got erased.
Yeah. So I'm going back to some of those because I always intended to do them. And this one is a little bit of a ghost story. It's got a little bit of U.S. military history, and it also features animals. So it's kind of a wacky mixed bag in terms of topics. And I decided to kind of back off of doing much of an intro on it because I kind of love the oddness of the story, and I want listeners to sort of hear how it plays out. Like there's an explanation of what initially seems supernatural to some people. So we're just going to kind of set the scene and then kind of explain what was really going on and how that came to be. So it starts in 1883. And at this point, a mysterious beast was spotted in Arizona. This is the first time that this particular one is spotted. And most of this story at the beginning, I should say, is all reported by the Mojave County Miner, which was a small newspaper. And I didn't have access to those particular ones. I have it written as relayed by another researcher. So just heads up on that. So in 1883, there were these two women who were home with their children while the men of the family were away tending their sheep flock. And they had had some issues with Native Americans and sheep issues that are not really germane to the story. But so while the men were away and these two women were at home alone with the children, they had an encounter which would unfortunately prove fatal for one of them.
So, according to the legend, shortly after one of the women left the house on Eagle Creek to go get some water, the dog started barking, and that prompted the other woman to go to the window and see what was going on.
And what she saw, she described as an enormous red beast ridden by the devil. She heard screams, but because she was too terrified to leave the house, she just kind of barricaded the door. She is said to have kind of frantically said prayers the rest of the time until the men returned.
So when the men came home and heard her story, they immediately mounted a search party for the other woman who had gone out to get water. But they didn't get far because they found her nearby, trampled to death.
And because this was sort of a mysterious death, there was some suspicion initially by the authorities that examined the body that maybe she had been murdered by someone in the family, even though the condition of the body was obviously very unique in that it had been trampled. There was an inquest, but in the end, the verdict in the investigation was reported in the local paper, the Mojave County Miner, that I mentioned as, quote, death in some manner unknown.
So just a few days after that, and a few miles northeast of the first sighting, two prospectors woke up in the night when their tent was crushed. They returned to their mining camp in Orr, Arizona, with tales of this impossibly tall horse. When a party made its way back to the trampled camp, they found red hairs and large hoof prints in the area.
And naturally, this, on top of the woman having been killed in this sort of mysterious way, really sort of started this, cultural phenomenon that is very natural of tall tales and gossip about what started to be called the Red Ghost. And some of the people talking about it claimed that they had seen and even pursued the Red Ghost. One said he saw it vanish into thin air before his eyes. So they really were laying on the supernatural abilities at this point.
About a month after the death of the woman at Eagle Creek, a rancher named Cyrus Hamblin was out getting stray cattle, kind of rounding them up, when he spotted the beast near the Salt River, and this was 80 miles northeast of the earlier sightings. And unlike previous encounters, he knew what it was. It was a camel.
Yeah, it was not entirely unheard of for camels to be in this area. Unusual, but not unheard of. And Hamblin could see that there was also some sort of load that was strapped to the animal's back, but he couldn't get close enough to catch the camel or identify what that was on his back. But he said that he believed that it looked like a deceased man, and eventually the camel escaped him.
Hamblin's word on the matter solidified this whole story of the Red Ghost, which people also called the Fantasia Colorado. That was what the Spanish-speaking settlers of the area primarily called it. The rancher was well respected, and his tale was not really embellished. He didn't put a lot of, crazy spin on it. He didn't throw in any supernatural or fantastical elements, except for the part that there was probably a dead man on the creature's back, which some people were kind of skeptical about.
Yeah, but he was very matter-of-fact about it. Like, I think there was a dead guy on the back of that camel. Which is a phrase you never think you're going to say, but there you go. So several weeks after Hamblin's incident, this time about 60 miles to the west of where Hamblin had his encounter, another group of prospectors spotted what was believed to be the same animal. This, at this point, having been still believed by some people to be supernatural and others to be like, no, it's camel. They thought that the best course of action was just to start firing wildly at it. And they didn't actually hit it, however, or if they did, they merely grazed it. But as it ran for its life, the burden that was on its back, because there was something on its back, dislodged. And the prospectors, once the camel had gone, advanced on this fallen cargo, and what they actually discovered was, in fact, a human skull with some hair and a very few shreds of decomposed skin still clinging to it. And so in this moment, Cyrus Hamblin's story was completely corroborated by this rather grisly discovery. So it once again supported, no, he is really a stand-up guy that doesn't talk crazy. There is a dead guy on that camel's back.
Yeah. In 1893, so 10 years after the first sightings of the Red Ghost, a man by the name of Mizzou Hastings found a red camel eating in his garden in Orr, Arizona, and this time he shot it dead. The camel had straps of leather still tied to it, and in some places the straps had cut into its flesh. This residual strap work led people to conclude that this was the same camel that had been running around the area with a corpse strapped to it for the last 10 years.
Yeah, the corpse wasn't actually there the whole time, but it was a very intricate, like a netting almost of these straps. So he had been wearing those straps and presumably pieces of this deceased person for quite some time. But who the dead man was remains something of a mystery.
I read your notes as where the dead man was remains something of a mystery, and I'm like scattered around the desert.
Yeah, that part we know, or we presume. And in the years between the time that the skull had been picked up and when Mizzou Hastings had killed the Red Ghost, and there had been other sightings during that time, but there had also been a lot of speculation that perhaps the corpse had been a man who had strapped himself onto the camel when he was thirsty and near death, hoping that the animal was going to eventually lead him to water.
Didn't work, apparently.
Well, they've realized that wasn't really what happened.
Well, once the felled camel and its straps had been examined, though, it was apparent that they could not have been tied by the man who was riding. And this conclusion led the Mojave County miner to say this: the only question is whether the man was tied on for revenge or merely as an ugly piece of humor by someone who had a camel and a corpse for which he had no use.
Yeah, so it's never really been solved one way or the other, in addition to who it was, but whether he had been alive or dead when he had been strapped to the camel. So the mystery of the Red Ghost was as solved at that point as it was ever going to be. However, that leads us to the next part of the episode, which is why a camel was wandering around the American Southwest in the first place. And before we get to that, we're going to have a word from our sponsor. So the introduction of camels into the U.S. was actually a military function. And it actually took 2 decades from the time the first studies were conducted about this idea to the actual introduction of camels into the American Southwest.
It all started in 1836 when E.F. Miller, Esquire, conducted a camel study and wrote a letter detailing his findings to the U.S. quartermaster, Captain George H. Crossman of Georgia.
And in the spring of 1843, so it was still some years later, U.S. Quartermaster General Thomas S. Jessup received a letter from Crossman extolling the potential virtues of camels as pack animals for use in military service. Crossman characterized camels as imposing and being potentially intimidating to the horses favored by Native Americans, so they felt that they would have the upper hand in any dealings with natives. And camels had also, after all, been part of various militaries throughout world history. And Crossman cited Miller's research as a source of validation for all his assertions about how great camels could be for the service.
This is because the Discworld books didn't exist yet. They do not.
We need to find a time machine and then hand it off to them. And
they don't pull any punches about how terrible camels can be to work with. Crossman also discussed using camels in the Army with the quartermaster, Henry Wayne, who was very interested in the idea.
And then in 1848, so this is still all percolating along via years and years and years, Henry Wayne went to the War Department with this idea. And though that had already taken quite some time, it was actually another 6 years before the concept of introducing camels into military service in the U.S. took another significant step.
That was in 1854 when Jefferson Davis, the Secretary of War, made a report to the Senate proposing the introduction of camels into Army use. And in addition to the previous missives that promoted the use of camels, Davis had also been influenced by naval officer Edward Fitzgerald Beale. Beale had read the writing of Évariste R. Houck, a French missionary who penned a travel diary called Recollections of a Journey Through Tartary, Tibet, and China during the years 1844, 1845, and 1846. He was really taken with the accounts of camels in this work, and he shared his very enthusiastic point of view on the topic with anyone who would listen, including Jefferson Davis.
And the timing of this at this point was good because of the increasing burden that the U.S. was facing in the Southwest at the time. So Davis's idea really was met with some enthusiasm. And this was because there was a growing need, both for transportation of troops as well as for moving heavy loads of supplies. So this is, mid-1800s when we are slowly pushing out to the West and things are being built. And the ability of camels to survive in conditions similar to those in the desert areas of the Southwest started to make them look like a pretty appealing solution to the problems.
So in early 1855, Davis was granted a budget of $30,000 to start working on a camel corps. He immediately sent Henry Wayne to the eastern Mediterranean to find suitable camels to buy.
And Wayne was joined in this mission by Navy Lieutenant David Dixon Porter, who was actually a relative of Beale. And the two men did not make a direct route through the Mediterranean to camel country. They actually stopped at many places along the way. They stopped throughout Europe. They interviewed camel experts and got their opinions. They talked to zoologists. They visited with royals who owned camels as part of their menageries. And they also made several stops around the Mediterranean. They visited Tunis, they visited Malta, and in some of these places they would purchase stock if they found it suitable. They also, while they were doing all of this stuff, dropped off Wayne's son at a French boarding school where the boy stayed for several years. He did not finish the camel travel.
While you're in France.
Why don't you go to school for a while?
Yeah. On February 15th, 1856, Wayne and Porter started their journey back to the U.S. aboard the USS Supply, and they were traveling with 33 camels. This was a mix of Arabian, Bactrian Tunis, and Tulu camels, along with 5 handlers.
This group landed at Indianola, Texas on May 14th. And that's where the camels were offloaded from the USS Supply. And then they began marching to their destination, which was Camp Verde. And they got to Camp Verde on August 27th of that same year.
In 1857, Porter made the journey to the eastern Mediterranean again, bringing back 41 more camels.
Also in 1857, Beale took one of the camel handlers, who was named Haji Ali, who you will also see him listed in historical references High Jolly, because apparently Americans that could not quite manage his name nicknamed him that.
See my expression of being rather nonplussed.
Yeah, he didn't apparently seem terribly concerned with it. But they all went on a survey expedition, which had been ordered by President James Buchanan. And this team was tasked with building a wagon road from Fort Defiance, New Mexico to the Colorado River. And they took 25 camels with them on this assignment so that they could test out the beasts. And it turned out that the camels did a really good job.
Side note, this wagon trail also marked the travel path that would eventually become the legendary Route 66.
Yeah. First found by camels.
Yeah. My friends, Nate and Carrie, drove the entire length of that as a summer vacation last summer.
I have friends that moved out to Los Angeles last year, and they did a similar thing on the way.
I think it's an awesome, fun thing if you have road trip time.
Yeah.
Having only witnessed other people doing it.
Yeah, I'm kind of like, let's get to the destination already.
Okay.
Not be in the car all day. But that's me. It turned out that these camels could easily carry 300 pounds, and they could travel for 4 miles an hour, which doesn't sound terribly fast, but compared to other options, they did quite well, especially considering their heavy cargo, with very few stops. So they could just kind of go all day long. And they didn't really need to have provisions for their meals carried along because they were able to grade on the cedar and the creosote bush that were plentiful along the route and which other pack animals could not eat. And the camels were also able to outlast other pack animals on difficult journeys. So in some cases, when they had brought other animals along, they would have to abandon them because they could not hack the conditions.
Oh, no.
Whereas the camels could just keep going.
That's terrible.
It is. This one's a little rough for the animal lover in me.
Henry Wayne, in particular, really championed the camel's usefulness. According to one story, after hearing remarks about the camels not being impressive as pack animals, he had one of his camels loaded with 4 hay bales, which totaled more than 1,000 pounds, to just show off how strong it was.
Yeah, again, the animal lover in me struggles with a little bit of this story. That's kind of abusive. But so initially, at this point, the Camel Corps looked like it was going to be a success because they were doing very well in the desert conditions. They could carry loads. They could outlast mules and horses, no problem. But of course, that is not the whole story.
If you've ever seen a book with a camel in it, or maybe just seen a picture of a camel.
If you've ever seen a camel.
You're right. Even if it's been a far away glimpse of a camel, you can probably grasp that they have tempers.
Yeah, I mean, that's what they're known for. When I think most people, if they just do a quick association and someone says camel, you think, oh my goodness, they're going to spit and trample me.
Yep. This proved to be a problem. They could be very difficult, and they sometimes completely disregarded their handlers. They would growl at soldiers as they approached with loads that they were going to
pack
onto them. Oh, and also camels smell pretty bad.
Yeah. And I'm sure they probably weren't getting washed very regularly.
I'm just imagining what effort it would take to wash a camel at this point in history.
Yeah. A lot.
It would take a lot of effort.
They couldn't just pull out a hose.
No. I mean,
they're au naturel.
Probably buckets.
Maybe.
Rainstorms.
Hope.
Okay.
And that smell is actually part of the reason, it's attributed to part of the reason why they spooked the horses. And as you recall, this had been a selling point for the Camel Corps when it came to the horses the Native Americans used. But this was a huge problem when there were horses that were being used by the same U.S. troops that were also employing the camels, and they had to deal with this interspecies problem. So the horses were not delighted by the camel's presence. They would get very scared. And keep in mind, these are large animals. So when one is angry and one is spooked, you can imagine how difficult it is to sort of corral that and then multiply that by the many that were traveling together.
Yeah, that could be deadly. That's
exactly.
A deadly combination.
And it's probably understandable that many of the soldiers openly complained about the situation. And even General David Twiggs, who commanded Texas and thus was a very powerful man in the military, he made it pretty clear that he would just rather have mules, and could we please not deal with these camels?
So as the Civil War mounted, Confederate troops took Camp Verde in February of 1861.
And so while the camels had proven their usefulness, they still were not a standard part of military operations. This was still considered an experimental concept. And they hadn't really been planned for as part of the Confederate war effort. So the animals then were, there at Camp Verde, and they were used and sometimes abused, again, a little difficult for the animal lover, in a variety of sometimes kind of odd ways.
Some were used for just transporting goods and freight, just like they had been prior to 1861. Some were used for entertainment rides, and some were sent around to other bases. One was allegedly pushed off a cliff by Confederate soldiers because they found it bothersome and they didn't want to take care of it. And some were just neglected or set loose.
Yeah, I mean, my heart breaks at the thought of an animal being
thrown off a cliff,
or even just abandoned or neglected. At the same time, just from the point of view of like someone in that situation, I can imagine that there is an element of, I don't know what to do with these things, and there is a herd of them at this camp, and they just didn't know how to deal with them. We should also mention that while being set loose in some cases may have seemed like a kindness, we should note that these animals had been bred in domestication. I mean, they were bred as stock. They weren't like wild camels that had been caught and tamed. So they had never been wild, and fending for themselves in the brush, even though they were physiologically, pretty well suited to the environment, was likely a very stressful situation. And additionally, when prospectors or cowhands would encounter these animals that had been set free just wandering, they kind of viewed them as target practice. So they were really treated very poorly and inhumanely.
Union troops took Camp Verde back in 1865. But Reconstruction resulted in a diversion of funds away from the Camel Corps. And as the railroad system was built farther and farther west, the camels had been helping to run supplies for a lot of the construction. The need for the camels just evaporated.
And in 1866, most of the remaining camels, when Camp Verde had been taken back, were sold at auction in New Orleans, Louisiana, and also in Benicia, California. And these were sold at significant loss. Some were purchased by circuses, carnivals, or zoos. Some were likely sold to be used as meat. Some were purchased by just private people who were like, I have money, I'll buy a camel. And then they often turned around and resold them for a much higher rate. They were in essence camel flippers.
I was just thinking camel flippers.
Yeah.
So today there are Camel Corps reenactors who keep a small number of camels for education purposes. There's a comedy film made about the whole thing in the 70s. And there's even a children's book about it.
There's also a memorial to the Camel Corps at the final resting site of the camel handler Haji Ali in Quartzsite, Arizona. And it's kind of a pyramid-shaped little memorial that stands there and references both Haji Ali's work as well as just the Camel Corps itself. Because he stayed in the U.S. even after his work as a camel handler was done.
While the Red Ghost was felled in 1893, camel sightings continued in Arizona, California, and Mexico well into the 20th century. Even in the 1950s, there were people who claimed that there were still camels in Sonora and Baja California.
Yeah, completely random species introduced and were allegedly, kind of surviving in the desert for a long time. Some being very elderly, I'm sure, and others possibly having mated and had their own little camel families.
I am going to say that I am relieved that it was not more like the introduction of kudzu.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine if camels overran the Southwest the way rabbits overran Australia?
I thought about that as I was doing this. I was like, I guess camels didn't do so well in the whole propagating and sort of, a huge blow up of population, which is good. I still feel very bad for the camels because I can't get past that. And it's interesting. You'll hear sometimes or read when you're looking at research about this. There are historians who like to theorize what would have happened if we hadn't completely abandoned the Camel Corps experiment, because it did seem like it had some, fairly, positive aspects to it, even though the camels tended to be grumpy and problematic. Some like to wonder what had happened if the Union Army had incorporated them into regular service after they had taken back Camp Verde. And we'll never know, of course, but we do know that they could survive on their own in the desert for decades. So, on the off chance you're in the Southwest and see a random camel, it's probably related to those.
Yeah.
There haven't been sightings in decades, so I would be shocked, but you never know. Unless some ridiculous wealthy person purchases one as a pet and then sets it free because they're a fool, it's probably not going to happen. But that is the Camel Corps. And that's one of those things that, because it involves so many moving parts and names that are also connected to other aspects of the Civil War, it can quickly blossom out into a very huge and long thing. And we may eventually cover other parts of this story that kind of interlock, but that's the scoop on why there was a camel running around looking like a devil, killing people
with a corpse.
Yeah. And it kind of explains, when you think about that, why that camel seemed to be pretty aggressive towards humans. It had clearly been treated badly. Someone had strapped a person to it and sent it off. It was carrying something around that was tied tightly enough to be cutting into its flesh, so it probably was very grumpy. Did not associate humans with good things.
No.
So.
Thank you so much for joining us for this Saturday Classic. Since this is out of the archive, if you heard an email address or a Facebook URL or something similar during the course of the show, that may be obsolete now. So here is our current contact information. We are at historypodcast@howstuffworks.com, and then we're at Missed in History all over social media. That is our name on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Pinterest, and Instagram. Thanks again for listening.
For more on this and thousands of other topics, visit howstuffworks.com.